Hey everyone and welcome back to the channel. Today we will be continuing our series called Viridian. The creator of this what if is Silver Mist anime lover or known as KR Stark Tower. If you like the video make sure to like, subscribe and share the video with your friends. Now on to the what if. Shouta wasn't sure what to expect from this year's crop of students. Last year, he'd expelled his entire class, and he wasn't above doing the same to this one. He was already in a bad mood, and he blamed Viridian wholeheartedly. That idiot had gotten himself seriously wounded about a week ago, when they ran into his crazy stalker, and he hadn't been replying to anyone on the group chat. Shouta had been unable to find him in any hospitals or clinics, meaning that the guy was either being treated by someone privately, he hoped, or was doing it himself again. He hoped Viridian had just damaged his phone again. Maybe Shouta should get him a hero-grade phone instead? Those were durable as hell, for this exact reason. With a sigh, he fished out his phone to send the vigilante another text. Let me sleep at Viridian Chaos, I swear to God, if you don't reply to one of us, I'm going to hunt you down after school and drag you to a goddamned hospital myself. As if he hadn't already been driving himself up the wall searching every crevice of Musutafu, he knew he even searched the south side each night. Fury, still no sign of him on my end, either. Shouta wouldn't admit it aloud, but he enjoyed the man's company, and possibly even considered him a friend. Not that he'd tell anyone that. So knowing that his maybe friend was hurt somewhere, and the fact that he hadn't seen him on patrol for several nights put Shouta in a pretty foul mood. His fuse was short enough without having to deal with a bunch of unruly teenagers who think they're hot stuff. He eyed his class from his position on the floor. The fluffy-haired kid, Midoriya, had noticed him instantly. That put Shouta on guard, because he was in stealth mode, the kind he used on underground missions. Nobody noticed him in stealth mode. Seriously, what is this kid? He carefully nodded in acknowledgement of the brat before he stood up, garnering the attention of the rest of the class. 8 seconds. It took you all that long to settle down. Time is precious, do not waste mine. He sent them a level look, climbing out of his comfortably warm sleeping bag. My name is Izawa Shouta, and I'll be your homeroom teacher for the duration of your time here at UA. He pulled out their gym uniforms. Now put these on and meet me outside on the field. With that, he walked out, stuffing his sleeping bag into his pocket, because his Ishi was amazing and got him the kind that folds up into the size of a phone. As he made his way outside, he felt his phone buzz. Viridian Chaos, sorry I've been offline for a bit. My phone got damaged when I got hurt. No need to worry, I'll be back on patrol within a night or two. I didn't even have to stitch myself up this time. An eraser, it's not like you could find me if you tried. Tongue sticking out, Shouta let out a breath of relief, alongside a sigh of irritation. Fury, damn it, Viridian. You're legally helping us, now. If you get hurt, we can let you see actual medical help. We won't even make you remove your mask. Viridian Chaos, sorry. Old habits die hard. Besides, I've got someone to help patch me up, so don't worry so much. Let me sleep, yes, well, we don't want you to die, so let us help you when you're fucking hurt. I swear you're as bad as my first years. Viridian Chaos changed let me sleeps name to Dadzawa, what is this? Viridian Chaos, I thought it was clever. Since you're like the dad of our little group. Fury, then what am I? Viridian Chaos, the mom. Want me to change your name too? Fury, forget I asked. Shouta hid his smile in his capture weapon as he pocketed his phone and waited for his students. That was one weight off his shoulders. Maybe he wouldn't expel his entire class. Maybe. Midoriya was the first kid out there. It'd taken him only a minute or so to come running out to meet him, and Shouta noticed something slightly off with his gait, like he was hurt. He raised an eyebrow. Though he'd implied that time was of the essence, most kids didn't pick up on that. Midoriya, once again, seemed to be the exception. I have the feeling I should get used to this. He impatiently shifted from one foot to the other as the other 19 students slowly trickled out, talking amiably amongst themselves. He resisted the urge to glare/sigh. He started speaking, giving his usual speech about how the system was illogical for disregarding quirks and pretending everyone was equal. One girl, Eureka, if he recalled correctly, had the guts to interrupt him and ask about orientation. We don't have time to waste on pleasantries like that. I've got 3 years to make heroes out of you, and every minute counts. UA is known for its free-form education. This applies to teachers, as well. That means I can teach you however I want, and I don't have to stick to government-issued standards. He waited a moment to make sure nobody else was going to interrupt him. You're familiar with these tests, you've been doing them all your life. Ball throws, endurance runs, grip tests, toe touches. This time, you can use your quirks. He called up Bakugo, the kid with the second highest score in the entrance exam. Normally, he'd call up the kid with the highest score, but Midoriya was quirkless and thus pointless for the purpose of this demonstration. He watched the familiar looks of awe as the children realized that they'd be allowed to use their quirks however they saw fit. This is going to be fun. Ashido squealed, making Shouta twitch. Oddly enough, he noticed Midoriya send her a glare of his own. Fun? You think this'll be fun? Alright, then, let's up the stakes. The person with the lowest score across the board will be expelled. He smirked into his capture weapon as the class dissolved into panic. Midoriya clenched his fists in. Was that anger? Determination? No, it was something more desperate. Before Shouta could look any deeper into his students' unusual reactions, his ears picked up someone crying about how unfair this whole thing was. He was about to open his mouth when he heard Midoriya laugh. It was a dark laugh, humorless. It sent a chill down Shouta's spine. Unfair? Hate to burst your bubble, but life is unfair. You think hurricanes and earthquakes are fair? Bombings? Villains? Listen, I know we're kids, but that's no reason to be so naive. As heroes, it's our job to make things fair. We take the brunt of the unfairness so the civilians can rest easy and pretend that life is kind and they can stay blissfully ignorant of the pain and death we'll face every day. He must have noticed that the class was staring at him either wide-eyed or in complete disregard. He's right. Shouta spoke up, startling the class. He wasn't going to lie. The kid's speech worried him more than he was willing to admit. But he was damn good at keeping his expression neutral, so he decided to pick up where he left off. It's a hero's job to level the playing field. Villains won't go easy on you just because you're having an off day. You can't take sick days as a hero, either. Once you debut, you're in. And the only way out is retirement or death. He made sure the kids at least heard him, even if they didn't yet understand. He ignored the eerie stare of Midoriya, how those eyes understood what he'd said, because it made his concern for the child spike again. Without further ado, he started the assessment. He'd honestly expected Midoriya to lag behind a bit, what with him lacking a quirk. Not that he'd expected him to necessarily be dead last, because there were plenty of people in this class with quirks that couldn't be used here, but he certainly hadn't been expecting him to place in the top 6. His physical capabilities were shocking, and the fact that he actually outlasted everyone in the endurance run had him reeling. Because though the kid looked utterly exhausted after the run, he'd had this look in his eyes. Like he had something to actually lose if he'd stopped. And for a moment, Shouta swore he'd seen the fear of death in those eyes, but he shook it off. Midoriya was definitely concerning him. Just what had this child been through? Because it was looking like his initial thoughts on the kid were accurate, he truly did look and act like a soldier. When Shouta had him do something, he'd do it to the best of his abilities. He was pushing himself far harder than the other students were. It was as if Shouta had threatened to kill someone dear to him if he'd failed the assessment. He prayed that there wasn't some villain who was holding someone hostage over Midoriya's head with the instructions to make it into UA. There were also several times that Shouta noticed he would wince, or flinch, especially during the toe touches. Again, he suspected that the kid was hurt. Though the winces were minor, so Shouta doubted it was anything major, as kids this age tended to have fairly low pain tolerances. Then again, Midoriya might have an abnormally high pain tolerance, for all he knew. But if Midoriya had gone to the hospital for anything, then Shouta would have been informed, so either it was nothing serious, or the kid was an idiot who didn't get an injury treated, not unlike a certain vigilante. Either way, unless something drastic happened, like he broke a bone or started bleeding out, he wasn't going to draw any unnecessary attention to the kid. He'd give him a slip to Sicho after class if the kid wanted to. There was an incident, while Kirishima was doing his ball throw. Bakugo had been glaring at Midoriya all morning, and he finally seemed to act on it. Deku. Shouta blinked at the nickname, he vaguely noted the red head. Kirishima, blink in recognition at the nickname. The way he said it indicated that it was an insult. He was sensing a history here that he didn't like. I don't know how the hell you cheated your way into UA, but someone like you shouldn't be here. I got in the same way as you by passing the entrance exams. Midoriya answered back. He didn't seem intimidated by the other boy, which made the blonde even more angry, but Shouta noticed the clenched fist of the quirkless child. He didn't seem scared, but there was obviously some sort of trauma there. Bakugo started to fire up his quirk as he made to throw a punch, and that was all Shouta needed to see. He erased Bakugo's quirk, and restrained him with his capture weapon. That's enough. I will not tolerate infighting in my class. If you're going to fight, do it in a spar. This is your only warning. He blinked and released his hold on the simmering student. They seem to have some negative history. I'll need to keep an eye on them both. And I swear, if this kid starts bullying anyone, I'll have him expelled faster than Nizu can make a cup of tea. Shouta also mentally noted to talk to Hound Dog about getting Bakugo anger management classes. Finally, he showed the results. Mineta was dead last. Honestly, Shouta didn't like how he'd been ogling the girls in the class, and though his record was clean, he had the feeling that someone had pulled a few strings to make it such. Said kid was now on the ground sniveling and crying like a pathetic infant. I might have actually spared him, if he'd had the decency to handle this graciously. But I honestly can't imagine this kid ever becoming a hero. His potential is zero. Mineta. Head to the front desk to fill out your paperwork. You're expelled. He stated firmly, and a few students looked at him wide-eyed. Why you mean you were serious? Yayorozu gasped in shock. What part of last place is expelled was unclear. Shouta sent her a mild glare. I have no qualms about expelling students who have zero potential. And you all may have proven yourselves to me today, but if I catch any of you getting complacent, I won't hesitate to cut you. I've expelled third years before. He warned, taking no small amount of pleasure in watching them stiffen. Good. Be afraid. Let that motivate you to do better. These next 3 years, we're going to push you to your limits and beyond plus ultra style. Keep showing me your best, and you'll become heroes one day. Now go, and make sure you grab your syllabus on your way out. He waved his hand in a shoe motion as he walked away. Oh, and Midoriya. The kid froze for a moment, looking uncomfortable. Here. If you're hurt, go see recovery girl. He handed over a nurse pass. Alright. Thank you, sensei. He bowed awkwardly before leaving Shouta to grab his syllabus. Interesting. He seems to hold little faith in teachers. It's likely that nobody bothered to stop the bullying before. He entered the teacher's lounge with a heavy sigh, even as President Mike greeted him boisterously. So, do you still have a class this year? Yes, I have 19 students remaining. Shouta announced, and several of his co-workers relaxed. You were right terrifying last year, when you came in after the first day announcing that you no longer had a class to teach. Snipe chuckled. No kidding. I thought you were joking until Nizu confirmed it. Midnight shook her head. So who'd you expel? Mineta Minoru. Shouta poured himself a cup of coffee as he curled up on the couch next to Hisashi. Kid has no potential as a hero. Isn't that a little harsh? All Might's brows knitted together in concern. We have a tough job. If someone doesn't make the cut, it's better to send them home crying than dead. Shouta defended his decision, making the other man wince. I suppose I see your point. He conceded. How'd the quirkless kid do? Did he pass? Midoriya placed 6th, actually. Shouta ignored the look of shock that painted the number 1 hero's face. He wondered if perhaps the man had something against quirkless people, but then All Might smiled a little. Or maybe he's biased. I'll need to make sure he doesn't treat Midoriya differently than his classmates negatively or positively. Shouta hesitated before pulling out his tablet. Whenever he performed assessments, Nizu wanted him to record his class. Mostly, it was so that he could justify any expulsions that occurred, but it was also to record their progress. But the kids, interesting. And concerning. Oh. Hisashi leaned in closer. Concerning how? I'm not sure. Shouta paused, trying to find the right words. There's something off with him. Like he's been through. He shook his head. I'll just show you. His co-workers gathered around. It wasn't often that a kid had left Aizawa. Shouta at a loss for words, so they were intrigued. When he pulled up the video, they heard Shouta's explanation about expulsion, and how one kid called him out on being unfair. A few staff members snorted in amusement at that. But then Midoriya laughed. And just like Shouta, the pros in the room felt a chill run down their spine. That laugh was dark and heavy, filled to the brim with something they couldn't quite name. No kid should laugh that way. Ectoplasm shuddered as 13 nodded. It made their heart hurt. It was so desolate. Unfair? Hate to burst your bubble, but life is unfair. You think hurricanes and earthquakes are fair? Bombings? Villains? Listen, I know we're kids, but that's no reason to be so naive. As heroes, it's our job to make things fair. We take the brunt of the unfairness so the civilians can rest easy and pretend that life is kind, and they can stay blissfully ignorant of the pain and death we'll face every day. Shouta turned off the recording, leaving his co-workers speechless. See what I mean? Something deeper is going on here. Kid sounds like he's speaking from experience. That's strange. Midnight's eyes were narrowed. He said I know. We're just kids, but I think he was going to say I know you're just kids. Maybe you should show this to Hound Dog. 13 suggested. I plan to, but I wanted to give you all a heads up. I don't think Midori is up to anything bad, but it's entirely possible that we're dealing with a traumatized kid, here. Shouta sighed as he laid back on the couch. He didn't want to deal with this. He wanted to expel his class again. The free time last year was amazing. Either way, he was stuck with this class for now. He just hoped that whatever Midoriya was dealing with wasn't something that would come back around and bite them all in the ass. God damn it. I just jinxed it, didn't I? Shouta swore he heard the universe laugh. Izuku sighed as he made his way through the mounds of trash. He'd managed to slip away without having to socialize with anyone. He felt a little bad, because he was pretty sure that Kirishima was Gaofan Imboy's brother, but he was emotionally exhausted. Not only was he around Aizawa, which he was used to again, because of the constant patrols as Viridian, but he was also constantly in the general area of Hisashi. He even glimpsed Power Loader, and that was hard. Yeah, he was not in the headspace to talk to people. But school was done, and he was blessedly alone. He smiled lightly to himself as he kicked open the door to his camper. Now, he could. Kigo was lazing on his couch with a bag of potato chips and a laptop streaming Netflix. Welcome home. Kigo greeted. Tadaima. Izuku deadpanned. Why are you in my house? Calling it a house is a bit of a stretch, don't you think? Don't you have an agency to run? So much for alone time. They can handle themselves. Kigo waved him off. So how was the first day of school? Pretty good. Though I think I pulled my stitches. Izuku pulled up his shirt with a wince. Damn it, Ziu. That was almost healed. Kigo groaned. Come here, let me look. With a sigh, Izuku removed his shirt completely, allowing Kigo to assess the wound. He realized idly that this was the first time Kigo had been able to see his entire torso without it being covered in blood. God. Izuku, you have so many scars. Kigo lightly trailed his fingers over one that stretched from his left collarbone to his right hip, causing Izuku to shiver lightly. He'd gotten that nasty one from a white Nomu. I've been through a lot of shit, K. One day, I hope you'll trust me with the whole story. Kigo answered after a long moment, and Izuku let out a sigh of relief. He was beyond grateful that the other man didn't press the issue. Now hold still while I fix the damage you did by running around like an idiot. Hey. I'll have you know that Aizawa made me run around like an idiot. Only because you didn't inform him of your injury. Oh, and I suppose you have a good cover story for this. Izuku gestured to the injury and all the scars that adorned his torso. Exactly. I can't just say oh, yeah. Please ignore all these scars. I can't really explain it right now, so forget you saw anything. I doubt a single teacher at UA would let this go. Well, of course not. Kigo shook his head. Most heroes wouldn't let it go. A 15-year-old kid with this many scars is not okay. I should probably come up with some kind of cover story, shouldn't I? I mean, with your luck, you'll end up in Recovery Girl's office by the end of the week. Yeah. I just hope I don't have any flashbacks. Izuku muttered under his breath. Flashbacks? I've known you for how many months, now? I've never seen you have a flashback. It's different when I'm Viridian. Izuku explained. When I put on the mask. It's like I'm dissociating a bit. Like my mask protects me. I'm not Midoriya Izuku, anymore. I'm not the quirkless freak or the useless subhuman that everyone calls me. He ignored the wince of the winged man. I'm the vigilante Viridian. I'm strong, and I can fight crime, and what bothers Izuku doesn't bother Viridian. My past can't haunt me as easily. So your triggers don't send you into flashbacks when you're in your vigilante mode, but when you're in your civilian mode. Yeah. It's strange, but I suppose I'm just that kind of messed up, you know. I don't think you're messed up. I think it makes you human. Kigo pulled Izuku into a hug. Don't ever call yourself a freak or a subhuman. I don't care what other people say. Quirked or quirkless, it's who you are that matters. Hey, K. Yeah, Ziu. I'm glad you're my brother. So am I. Chapter 9, Explosion and Flashbacks. Izuku ran swiftly and silently, taking as many confusing and sharp turns as he could. His heart was pounding in his throat as he swore he felt the hot breath of the Nomu on the back of his neck. He didn't dare turn to look as a fresh wave of adrenaline hit his system, giving his exhausted muscles a renewed energy. He recognized the broken-down music store on the corner and immediately whipped into an alleyway, praying it was still there. He let out a mental cheer as he jumped for the fire escape. He started climbing before he even got a proper grip, and the sound of claws against the brick wall made him shudder. It was so close he could feel the ghost of the claws on his leg. Too close. He made record time clambering up onto the rooftop. Most of them were shit climbers, but that didn't really matter when they could topple the entire building. It was just his luck that he'd managed to run into a white Nomu. They were wicked fast, and had ungodly sharp hearing. Luckily, this one had some kind of permanent injury, so it wasn't quite as fast as it should have been. Izuku made quick time jumping from rooftop to rooftop. He winced as he jostled his injured arm. He had it tied with a strip of fabric he'd lucked upon off some guy's remains. Sure, it wasn't the most sanitary option, but it was certainly better than leaving a blood trail that'd lead them straight to his group. He zigzagged as much as he dared across the rooftops, unsure if the sounds he was hearing on street level was the Nomu or his imagination. When he felt relatively confident enough, he stopped on a rooftop, bunkering down and hiding behind some old rubbish. His heart was pounding. He could feel the blood in his entire body, from fingertips to the crest of his head. He took several long quiet breaths to calm his heart as much as he dared as he listened for the Nomu. It was 20 minutes before he felt safe enough. Nothing was safe anymore. Safety was false to leave his hiding spot and head back. He thanked his lucky stars when he managed to roof hop back to base safely. The adrenaline was quickly leaving his system by that point, and he'd nearly fallen off a rooftop twice as he made his way back. He even had a scraped chin for his efforts. He carefully picked the lock and let himself in. The room was dark and dank and covered in years of dust. He was careful to disturb as little of it as possible, holding his old weathered backpack close to his chest. He only relaxed minutely when he stumbled his way down into the basement. "Sho? Zashi? I'm back." His whisper sounded like a scream in the quiet. A moment later, he heard a small knock. Just as quickly, he lightly tapped out a specific pattern. A near-silent sigh of relief sounded as the door quietly swung open, allowing Izuku access. "Took ya long enough, little listener." Hisashi smiled as he ruffled the tangled green locks, closing and locking the door tightly behind him. "Well, sorry. The place was crawling with Nomu." He shuddered lightly. "I saw 2 white Nomu, too. We should stay hidden for a bit." "White Nomu?" Shouta tilted his head, gesturing for Izuku to come forward so he could treat his injuries. He collapsed into a chair, letting his screaming muscles rest at last. "Hisashi. took pity on him and handed him a bottle of water. Izuku idly noted that they'd need to boil more water soon. Oh, that's right, Shao. You haven't seen them. Hisashi noted idly. They're the fast-moving ones. They're really thin and not nearly as strong as the darker Nomua, but they've got the claws and fangs to kill. Izuku finished with a shudder, remembering how one had effortlessly caught up to some guy with a speed quirk and tore him in half. Right. We're staying far away from that one. Shouta grimaced. Agreed. At the very least, they're mostly blind, so as long as you're quiet, you're safe. Hisashi smiled softly as he kissed Izuku on the forehead. You know, it's almost domestic. Ha. Izuku laughed dryly. I suppose you're right. You know, except for the fact that I'm in my 30s. He flopped down on the chair. The room was rather large, thanks to Power Loader's help before he died. Izuku's eyes drifted over to the sleeping occupants in the room, before Shouta spoke again. Shush, problem child. You're still a kid to us. Yeah, because you two are old. Izuku snickered as Hisashi laughed and Shouta glared half-heartedly. Any trace of her? Shouta finally asked, and the room turned somber. Several sleeping people shifted, and Izuku knew they were listening. He swore he saw Dabi's eye crack open, too. No. I found nothing. Izuku clenched his fists in frustration, as Hisashi glared at the ground. I'm sorry. No, little listener, it's not your fault. Hisashi pulled him into a gentle hug. Nemuri is strong, I'm sure she'll be okay. Shouta and Izuku didn't bother to correct him. They shared a despairing look over Hisashi's shoulder. They both knew the odds. Nemuri was most likely dead. Once Shigaraki got you, you were lucky to be dead. And if you weren't, then you became a Nomua. Izuku's heart clenched at the thought of Nemuri, his first true mother figure, becoming a monster like that. You're hurt, let me take a look at that arm. Hisashi realized, carefully unwrapping the injury that Shouta hadn't gotten to yet. You can stop pretending to sleep, Dabs. Izuku called out, looking at the dark-haired youth. You're too observant, brat. Dabi sighed as he sat up and stretched. Hey, elf. Wake up, Izu's back. The other occupant in the room cracked open an eye. Izu. Hey, Tamaki. How was your nap? You look like shit. He deadpanned, and Izuku cracked a smirk. You look like Shao. I'm so done with you both. Shouta sighed, as Hisashi laughed. The five of them were all that was left of a group that was once nearly 20 strong. Things were looking worse and worse by the day, and even now, after years of this shit, Izuku still couldn't wrap his head around the reality that was now their world. He sometimes kept expecting to wake up at home, but he knew it would never happen. He'd likely never see anyone outside of this group again. Though he'd heard whispers years ago about an underground resistance group, he wondered if they were still alive. Izuku looked at the people that surrounded him. Hisashi Yamada, once a pro-hero known as Present Mike. His once long blonde hair was stringy and dirty, and had been cut off at his shoulders for safety after he was nearly killed when it caught in a Noma's mouth. That same incident caused damage to his left knee. With no way to properly treat it, it healed wrong. He had a permanent limp, but the cane Shouta had stole for him did look pretty kick-ass. He was filthy, and his clothes were ragged. Izuku couldn't tell what color they were supposed to be anymore. He didn't wear his glasses anymore, and his lip and ear piercings stood out against his pale, dirty skin. Izawa Shouta, also a former pro-hero called Eraserhead, was Hisashi's husband. He'd been after Izuku back when he'd been a vigilante, and he was very good at his job. His black hair hung around his shoulders, unkempt, knotted, and filthy. The bags under his eyes looked more like bruises at this point, and the ever-present air of exhaustion around him seemed to have amplified over the past few months in particular. His stubble was becoming a short beard, and he was also covered in grime and filth. Dabi was a former villain. He didn't tell them his original name, but he'd once confessed to Izuku that he was the eldest son of the old pro-Endeavor. He'd run away due to abuse, and faked his own death. Izuku had to give him props for that. He wasn't sure he'd have the guts to fake his own death like that. Turned out, in the apocalypse, titles like hero and villain really didn't matter to anyone. What mattered was how you could contribute to the group. And Dabi had a surprisingly vast knowledge of medicine. If it weren't for Dabi, Izuku probably wouldn't be alive right now. Like the others, he was also covered in filth. He was nursing a bad ankle, which is why he couldn't join Izuku on the food run, like he usually did. Finally, they had Amajiki Tamaki, also a former pro known as Suna Ader. He'd been terribly unconfident and quiet when Izuku first met him. It reminded him a lot of himself when he was younger. He connected with Tamaki instantly, and the brooding elf-like man felt most comfortable and confident around Izuku. He'd gained a lot of confidence over these last few years, anxiety dropping down to manageable levels in the face of the end of the world. He often talked to Izuku about Mirio, his old friend who perished in the early Nomu attacks defending civilians. "I'll start dinner," Shouta decided as he rifled through Izuku's backpack. He paused and stared incredulously at the box of Twinkies. "What?" "I went out on the food run. It's my special treat for putting my life in danger. I would have grabbed the Klondike bars, but they would have been melted by the time I got back." "Only you?" Dabi shook his head with a fond smile. "What's that supposed to mean?" Izuku pouted. "You really grabbed junk food? You are a kid." Hisashi ruffled his hair again. "Zushi," Izuku complained, making the blonde grin. "You are the youngest, Izu." Tamaki pointed out. "You're like our baby brother, so let us fuss over you once in a while, okay?" Izuku continued to pout, even as Shouta started to put dinner together. He was really happy with his family, no matter how much he missed those they'd lost. He just wished he could do more for them. He felt like he never contributed to them enough. Even so, he never wanted this moment to end. This peace. This happiness. They'd all lost so much, he didn't want to lose any more. A moment later, the entire scene blurred. Suddenly, Izuku was outside, running with Shouta, and the cries of the Nomu reached up towards the deaf heavens like a terrifying symphony. Thunder rolled ominously in the background. Izuku's nose itched with the far too familiar scent of blood. Hisashi had gone out with Tamaki and Dabi to fetch some water. Normally, Zushi wouldn't go, but Tamaki had hurt his arm last week on a food run, and the last time they'd sent Dabi out to get water, he almost hadn't come back alive. Hisashi, at the very least, could provide some long-range support. While his quirk was ill-suited to this apocalypse the Nomu were attracted to sound. He was a damn good shot with that crossbow he'd snatched a while back. Izuku had known that Hisashi's main reason for insisting on going out was because he was tired of being useless. He understood that better than most. That frustration, being treated like glass, all because he had a bad leg. Hisashi had lasted quite a while, but they'd all known he was going stir-crazy locked up in the base. Shouta tried his best to stay behind with him as often as he could, but even he went out on runs with Izuku often. With only 4 able-bodied people, they couldn't risk benching someone. But then Izuku had gotten a really bad feeling, and he and Shouta had run out to find them. Tamaki and Dabi were nowhere to be found, but Hisashi had been hiding behind a building where several Nomu were lurking. "Zushi," Shouta whispered urgently, and the blonde looked beyond relieved to see them. His pupils were dilated with fear and pain. His bad leg was bloodied, and he was keeping weight off of it. "God, what happened?" Shouta pulled his husband into a hug. "We were attacked." Hisashi shook. I wasn't able to do anything. There were white Nomu. I thought the river was usually safe." Izuku felt fear grip his heart. "Where were Tamaki and Dabi?" "Blue Nomu." Hisashi hissed. "One of them got Tamaki. Pulled him under the water." His face scrunched up in pain as he relived that moment, and Izuku's heart stuttered. Blue Nomu, the water-based Nomu. They look like the old stories of sirens or man-eating mermaids. Fish-like tails and thin gangly bodies. Sometimes they're scaled. Other times they have skin. They look like the sirens decided to mate with a waterlogged corpse. They were thin and polluted whatever water source they lived in. If you drank that water, you'd get sick. And if you died with that water still in your system, you'd become a Nomu. They also had the bad habit of dragging their victims beneath the surface and either drowning them or eating them alive. Underwater. Tamaki was gone. What about Dabi? Izuku asked, shoving his grief to the back of his mind. He could think about his brother later. He ran off to distract the Nomu. Keep them away from me, but I wasn't fast enough. One of them still got my leg. I killed it, but... Hisashi winced. "It'll be okay, Zushi. Shouta put his husband's arm around his shoulders to help support him as they walked. Izuku, keep the Nomu off of us, we need to get back to base. Right. Izuku nodded. Dabi would be fine. He was strong. They'd set up several meet-up spots in case they got separated, they'd just pick him up later. He would be fine. He rested his hand on the hilt of his sword just to make sure it was still there. The storm was swiftly descending upon them. Izuku's hair stood on end a moment before a blinding flash overtook his vision. The near-instantaneous clap of thunder shook the ground like an earthquake. When he could finally see, he realized that lightning had struck really close to them, and had set some of the trees ablaze. Heavy sheets of rain did nothing to snuff out the fire as it quickly grew, fed by the weeks of drought they'd suffered. The fire blocked their quickest escape route, and the Nomu were agitated, now. The thunderclap had been loud enough that Izuku's ears were still ringing, and both Shouta and Hizushi looked to be in similar states. Izuku caught movement from the corner of his eye and only barely managed to block the claw from the white Nomu with his sword in time. A shiver ran down his spine as he stared into the tiny beady eyes that could only truly catch motion. He'd gotten a lot faster and stronger than he'd been when he first encountered these things, but he could still only barely keep up with them. This was bad. He caught sight of Shouta herding Hizushi off to hide behind some rubble nearby just as Izuku noticed another Nomu joining the party. It was tall, and stood on two legs. Black scales stretched halfway up the leg before it tapered off to skin. It was thin, but not sickly so like the white Nomu. Its brain was almost entirely exposed, sans a protective crown-like protrusion of bone around the base. A large snout indicated it was good at hunting by smell, and a long thin whip-like tail swished dangerously behind it, small bone-like blades glinted in the storm. A black Nomu. Just his fucking luck. They were pack hunters. Judging by the size of the crown, this was a drone, one of the males. Izuku was never more grateful for his analysis skills in all his life. He'd studied the different types of Nomu years ago. The black Nomu, not to be confused with the dark Nomu, served a queen, like bees. The workers, or drones, hunted, but they seemed to have a sort of hive mind with one another. This was bad. Really, really bad. One white Nomu was survivable. But packs of black Nomu could number anywhere from 5 to 50, definitely not something he could survive alone. He barely dodged the swipe from the white Nomu and parried the whip-like tail of the black Nomu. But the white Nomu took advantage of his distraction and wrapped its own whip-like, thankfully non-blade, tail around Izuku's arm, yanking him harshly to the ground. He instinctively rolled, scarcely missing the white Nomu's killing strike, but found himself crying out in pain as the black Nomu's tail got him in the arm. He swiped at it, attempting to cut it off, but he missed it by a hair. He quickly assessed the damage. Nothing permanent. He could still use his arm, though strikes would be weaker. Blood trail was now a concern if he managed to escape. Shit. It wasn't looking good. He ducked under another tail whip from the black Nomu, and ran at the white Nomu, feinting to the side as he managed to somehow lob off half its tail. It'd be slower, now, as it adjusted to the loss of balance. The white Nomu screeched, and Izuku heard the not-so-distant screeches of the other black Nomu. Reinforcements were on their way, and it wasn't for his side. He gritted his teeth as he dodged to the side, narrowly avoiding a claw swipe from the white Nomu. He had to make a move, and make it now. Izuku feigned dodging to the left, only to dive underneath the black Nomu's legs. He scampered up its back in record time, scarcely holding on as it screeched in anger, trying to shake him off. The tail nearly hit him, and he didn't hesitate in stabbing the brain. He realized the moment it went in that the jostling had altered the trajectory. Instead of stabbing it in the brain and killing it, it wedged itself between the brain and the skull. Non-fatal. Izuku was blindsided by the Nomu's tail hitting his shoulder, knocking him off its back. He bit back a cry of pain as he hit the ground hard. The tail tore through his flesh and he swore he felt it touch bone. His eyes tracked the black Nomu as it came in for the kill. He wasn't going to make it in time. So this is how I die. He realized. The thought startled him a bit. He'd joked about it before, but as the jaws of the black Nomu unhinged, dividing into 3 parts, it really hit home. He was going to die. His eyes traveled to Shouta and Hizushi, who were still hiding behind the rubble, tears in their eyes as Hizushi held back Shouta, covering his mouth so he didn't attract attention. He was grateful they were alive. Izuku smiled at them. He was okay with this. As long as they survived, that was what mattered. That was all he needed. Then, everything went white, and a searing heat burned the fine hairs of his arm. A sound far too loud to identify shook the ground beneath him. Was this death? He felt something wrap around his leg and drag him across the ground. Shouta pulled him into a fierce hug, and it took him several minutes to understand what had occurred. Lightning had struck the black Nomu as it had been about to devour him. The failed kill strike that had nearly cost him his life had acted as a lightning rod, saving him at the last possible second. He was alive. He'd literally been saved by chance. What were the fucking odds? He felt like laughing. Or sobbing. Or something, but he was in too much shock to process anything. Hear me? Izuku? Hisashi whispered quietly, and he shook his head. Sound was returning to him. Yeah. I think so. He answered back quietly. Don't you ever do something so stupid again. I thought we were going to lose you. Shouta had tears running down his face. So did I. Izuku admitted. A growling sound made him turn his attention to the three new black Noma that had entered the scene. They sniffed at the body of their fallen pack-mate, and Izuku thanked the rain for making it harder to track scents. Izuku looked around with a sinking feeling. They had no escape. Those black Noma would surround them first chance they got, and Izuku was in no shape to fight, now especially when his only weapon, aside from a pair of daggers, was stuck in a dead Noma's skull halfway across no man's land and fried to a crisp. Shouta was good at escaping, and getting other people away, but he fought best against close combat Noma. Black Noma fought long-ranged. They were trapped. And with Hisashi's bad leg, there wasn't any way for him to move quickly enough to run. Izuku. Shouta. When I give the signal, you need to run. Hisashi's voice was quiet as he shook in his boots, whether that was the chill from the icy rain, or the fear. Izuku didn't know. What the hell was he talking about? Izuku looked into Hisashi's eyes, and he understood. No, Hisashi, you can't. Hisashi. Shouta shook his head with an urgent whisper, eyes filled with tears. You idiot, come with us. No, Shao. You know I can't. With my leg the way it is, I'll only slow you down. Hisashi smiled softly at him, before pulling Shouta into a kiss. I love you, don't you ever forget that. Hisashi then tugged Izuku into a hug, as the greenette fought back his own tears. Izuku wanted time to pause. To just be held by Hisashi for eternity with Shouta's arms wrapped around them both, and then everything would be okay. But it wasn't okay. The Noma's growls told him that. I'm sorry. Izuku choked out. If he'd just been a little stronger. A little faster, if he'd fought a little harder, then Hisashi wouldn't have to do this. This was all Izuku's fault. Hisashi looked Izuku in the eye. Look. After Shouta for me, would ya, little listener? I know my hubby's a lot to handle, but please, for my sake, look after him. He pressed something into Izuku's hand and shoved him back before dashing out of their hiding spot as quickly as he could, Shouta's hand missing him by millimeters and letting loose an ear-shattering quirk-enhanced scream, pushing back the three black Noma while attracting the attention of the white one. Distracting them from Izuku and Shouta. Run. Izuku clenched his fists, Hisashi's wedding ring digging into the palm of his hand as he made his choice. He picked up a struggling Shouta with strength he didn't know he had, and made a break for it. He saw Hisashi smile brightly in relief even as the Noma closed in on him. Thank you, little listener. Hisashi. Shouta's blood-curdling scream was cut short as Izuku knocked him out, leaving a trail of tears in their wake. I'm sorry, Shouta. He whispered, his own eyes blurred with hot tears. I'm so sorry. The sky continued to cry. Izuku bolted upright in the camper on Dagobah Beach, heart thudding in his chest. He took a moment to take a few shaky breaths. The echoes of the cries of the Noma. The smell of blood in the air, and the absolute deafening silence of everything. The fact that it was raining outside didn't help, either. Stop it. He forced himself to whisper, scratching at the sheets to make noise, even as thunder rumbled. The jaw unhinged, and he looked his own death in the maw. It's not here. It's just a memory. He swallowed back his tears as he gently pulled out the pair of rings from under his shirt. The two clinked together quietly, though if one looked closely enough, one of the bands had dried blood crusted in the grooves of the metal. The rings had Celtic-like knots with a small stone set into the gold. One was green Shouta's and the other was purple Hizashi's. Shouta's ring had a small cockatoo engraved with a music note in the shape of a heart, and Hizashi's had a cat with the same music note. They both had a phrase engraved that read, "Forever in harmony." Zashi. He brought his knees up to his chest. Shouta. The two had been like brothers, maybe close uncles, they were family to him. And it was so fucking hard to look at their younger selves and know that he was just another student to them. They'd never. Hizashi turned towards Izuku as the Noma closed in on him. Even as one of the black Noma's blade tails speared him through the middle, ensuring his fate. "Thank you, little listener." He smiled, as the stop it. He whispered to himself, louder this time. He took another shaky breath as he tried to stave off the tears and sobs. A gentle hand on his shoulder made him startle badly. He looked up into concerned golden eyes. "Izuku. Go." That was all he needed before he broke down into his friend's arms. The startled man wrapped his wings around the sobbing child, not understanding what was going on, but knowing that he needed the comfort. It was such a relief to have someone there. He felt himself slowly coming back to this reality. A reality where he could make a difference. It took 30 minutes for Izuku to compose himself. Sorry. Hey, it's okay. It's bad to bottle things up like that, you know. If you ever need someone to talk to, I'm here. I appreciate that, K. But I'm not sure if I can explain anything right now. I'm just saying. Whenever you're ready, so am I. Kigo then tossed Izuku's school uniform at him. Now come on, you've got school in 2 hours. Izuku groaned. The USJ incident was fast approaching. According to Shao, the third day of school tomorrow was when Shigaraki disintegrated the door to UA, and stole the schedule that would lead to the USJ attack later that same day. Shigaraki, himself, would show up at that attack. It was Izuku's best shot at killing the man, and preventing everything. Both Shouta and Izuku had agreed that it was their best, perhaps only shot. After that, Shigaraki had become much more cautious, and sent his underlings out to do his dirty work. If Izuku was going to kill him, it would have to be then. He shook himself and dressed in his school uniform, readying himself for the day ahead. It would have to be then. Kigo looked at him with a smile as he handed Izuku a raincoat. "What's this?" Izuku raised an eyebrow. He didn't even know he owned a raincoat. "You had a rough night. Figured you'd want to go for a flight." He smirked. "I thought you hated flying in the rain. I can make an exception." Kigo grinned. Izuku sighed as he sat down in English class. The field had helped more than he'd been willing to admit, and he really had to thank Kigo for that. Hisashi Yamada-sensei was calling the room to attention. Izuku couldn't help the slight flinch at the loud noise, but masked it as a cough. He wasn't entirely sure if it'd fool the blonde despite appearances. His Yamada-sensei was rather observant. He knew he couldn't get away with just acting like it didn't happen. And every time he saw Yamada-sensei, Hisashi's blood-stained smile would overlap, and he just couldn't. Izuku tried his hardest not to look at his teacher for too long. Shao Izawa-sensei, damn it, that memory last night really fucked him up, must have noticed something off during the assessment the day before and warned the other teachers, because Yamada-sensei was discreetly watching him throughout the entire lesson. Though after the initial flinch, Yamada-sensei did lower his volume, for which Izuku was grateful. Izuku made sure to do his best to stay under the radar. No sense in drawing any unnecessary attention when he was likely going to be expelled for killing a villain anyways. Can they expel me for that if it's self-defense? Izuku kept that thought in mind all throughout morning classes. Once lunch rolled around, he sped off towards the library before any of his classmates could stop or follow him. He felt bad, seeing Kirishima's disappointed look, and made a mental note to talk to the kid later today. It only took him 8 minutes to find the book he was looking for, and a further 12 to find what he was looking for in said book. The book on hero and heroine training law. According to this, a hero is allowed to kill a villain so long as there's ample reason. Like the villain using lethal force, or the hero is dying or severely wounded. No wonder Endeavor can get away with charring his victims. Most villains use lethal force anyhow. And with the way this is worded, so long as someone is in danger, hero, civilian, or hero in training, A hero is allowed to use lethal force, and cannot be held accountable for murder except under very specific circumstances. But this also applies to heroes in training under 3 conditions. 1. They are in an internship or something similar and their hero mentor or sensei gives them permission to attack. 2. They have a provisional license. 3. The hero in training is acting on the grounds of their hero school. And USJ is on UA grounds. Izuku would later deny the very eraser-head-like smile that graced his lips. I can legally kill Shigaraki and stay in UA without retribution. I can still be a hero. His smile dimmed, as the images of fallen comrades and friends flashed behind closed eyelids. I'll help as many people as I can. Shouta and Hisashi flickered across his mind, quickly followed by Nemuri, Dabi, and Tamaki. The ghost of Hisashi's hand ruffling his filthy blood-stained hair, and Shouta pulling him into a warm embrace as they grieved together for the loss of their sunshine. Nemuri's soft laughter as she cooked breakfast for the hungry boys, smiling gently as her lips brushed Izuku's forehead in a way that he imagined a kind mother would do. Dabi playfully shoving him in a way that made him feel like an older brother, while Tamaki played peacekeeper between them when things got too heated. He remembered Power Loader teaching him things about support items that he'd never known before. They'd stay up into the wee hours of the night and well past sunrise working on projects together until someone, usually Fat Gum, came to drag them out. Hell, he even missed Quip, a fellow vigilante who he'd been rather close to before the apocalypse hit. Izuku had given him his vigilante name, and it stuck. He didn't realize he was crying until Ectoplasm, the current librarian, came over. Are you okay? He asked softly, handing Izuku a tissue. He hastily wiped away his tears and took the proffered cloth. Why, yeah. Sorry, I was just missing someone. If you ever need to talk, I'm always here. People don't usually bother to come to the library. Izuku hesitated a moment. Would it be stranger for him not to say something? The man seemed genuine in his offer, and Izuku felt somewhat bad that he couldn't confide in anyone. I'll keep that in mind. Thank you. Ectoplasm smiled softly, or at least Izuku got the impression he was smiling softly. He could tell it was a mask thing, before turning back to organizing his books. Izuku quietly put his books back and made his way back to his classroom. He wasn't hungry anymore, and though he knew he'd probably regret this decision later, the memories of blood-stained friends twisted into unrecognizable corpses and the echo of the smell of iron made the thought of food revolting. Even if he was dying to try Lunch Rush's food. And yeah, he was still fighting off the lingering effects of malnutrition, but he was good enough to fight as Viridian, so he'd manage a stupid heroics class. Besides, Kigo was making sure that he was putting the pounds back on. He was the first person back in the classroom. Izuku raised an eyebrow as he held a stack of papers under his arm. Bright red eyes framed by blue hair glowed menacingly as a hand reached towards him. He was terrified, and knew that the only reason he was alive was because of Shouta. Izuku shook his head sharply, dislodging the memory. Izuku's eyes lit up in well-hidden concern, but Izuku smiled softly. I'm just tired, he explained, and while he could tell that his half-assed explanation did nothing to convince his sensei, said man still let it lie and continued out of the room, much to Izuku's relief. Though Izuku caught a half-muttered, I'm here if you need to talk. Wow, teachers at UA really were different. That's too that it offered him an open ear if he needed it. And he was quirkless. That's more than he'd had in his entire life, either of them. Slowly, the class started to trickle in, and a few attempted to make small talk with him. He sighed when he realized that the teacher was going to be late. Hey, Midoriya. Kirishima grinned. You're the one my brother talked about, right? AnimeBoi is his username. Yeah. Izuku smiled softly. My screen name is Deku, he explained. He told me to keep a lookout for you. Sorry it took so long. I'm kind of socially awkward. That's fine, my brother is, too. Kirishima grinned. I think you're awesome, Mido bro. Mido, bro. He blinked, unsure how to take the new nickname. So, Midoriya. The pink girl, Ashido, excitedly leaned towards him, cutting off whatever Kirishima was going to say. I have to ask. What's your quirk? My quirk. Izuku blinked. Didn't they? Oh. He didn't tell them. He opened his mouth to affirm that he did not have one when Bakugo decided to be an ass and do it for him. Deku. Ha. That little wimp doesn't have a quirk. He's quirkless. I have no idea how the fuck he managed to get into UA. Quirkless. Aitsa echoed, confused. Gee, thanks asshole. Izuku threw Bakugo a tired glare, startling the blonde. But yeah, I'm quirkless. I still managed to get into UA same as the rest of you. So doubt me if you want, but just know that underestimating me will not end well for you. There was a glint in his eye that made the class falter. I think it's so manly. No quirk in you. Still got in. Bro, you're incredible. Kirishima grinned, taking Izuku aback. What? He blinked. He'd been so ready for the jeers and teasing, already having built the wall around himself in preparation, but, what? Yeah. Kaminari grinned. Jiro gave him a thumbs up, too. I think you're very brave and definitely someone I wouldn't underestimate on the battlefield. If you could take down those robots without a quirk, then you must be a force to be reckoned with. Tokoyami said quietly. Though I gotta ask, how did you beat them? Ashido was literally bouncing in her seat. Oh. I fight with a sword. Izuku explained. But you stopped the zero-pointer and saved me. Yurika argued. Oh, that. I hacked it from a downed robot. I rewrote the code and initiated a force shutdown for all nearby robots, including the zero-pointer. He shrugged as if it was no big deal. You. Is that even allowed? Aitsa looked scandalized. Anything goes in a real battle. Even nuts hots. At any rate, I don't think Niza was angry about it, though I do have a meeting with him after school today. He rubbed his chin as he thought, idly missing his stubble. Before anyone could say anything else, All Might strode in, making Izuku stiffen. Great. He ignored the long-winded explanation, or maybe it wasn't that long. Izuku didn't really pay any mind to it either way, before he grinned at his costume. Perfect. His hero costume was one that he'd put a lot of time and effort into. If he was really going to go the whole way and actually become a hero, then he would need to go into underground heroics, not that he minded, necessarily, that would have been his first pick anyways. So with that in mind, he went with a darker color scheme. The dark green and black skin-tight suit allowed for ease of movement without the risk of loose clothing catching on anything. There were plenty of pouches and hidden pockets along his utility belt, and his trusty black katana hung comfortably on his back. A pair of sai hung on his thighs. He had nothing covering his hair or face with the exception of a very Eraserhead-esque pair of black goggles that currently hung around his neck. They had night vision qualities as well as heat-seeking tech. Plus, they'd help keep smoke and dirt from obscuring his vision. His black boots had shock absorbers and hidden knives. He may have looked similar to his Viridian persona, but there was little chance of them connecting the dots, not when he'd convinced Tsukachi and Aizawa so wholly that Viridian was an adult. In short, he looked unassuming at first glance, but he was actually armed to the teeth. Izuku smirked. This was going to be fun. Okay, scratch that. This was going to suck. All Might had pitted him against Bakugo of all people. Izuku didn't know how, but he had a feeling that it was either on purpose, or a lucky accident. Either way, his teacher looked way too happy with the matchup. He supposed that All Might simply thought that the two were friends since they went to the same school, but Izuku was not an idiot. He knew he had weak points and faults just like everyone else. He was just better at hiding them. Explosions, specifically the dust that they could easily kick up, and collapsing buildings and the ringing silence that came thereafter was something that could easily pull him into a flashback. He also hated sudden loud noises, but explosions were the worst. He blamed childhood trauma. He knew this, which is why he tried his best to stay away from Bakugo whenever possible. It was also why he tended to do his vigilante work at night, when the flashier villains who would cause said explosions were not out and about. Diurnal heroes could handle those villains themselves, anyhow. Though there had been several times in the last 4 months that he'd had to act as Viridian during daylight hours, like that bank robbery incident last week. Maybe that's why people were mistaking him for a hero? Because the police didn't arrest him for vigilantism? All Might? Izuku asked quietly, making sure none of his classmates would overhear. I was wondering if I could switch opponents. I know that normally this isn't allowed, but I have bad reactions to explosions, and was going to talk to Hound Dog about working around it at the end of this week. Izuku was trying to be mature about this. He really was. After all, he knew, logically, that this fear of his was extremely dangerous in the field of heroism, never mind the fact that it didn't affect him nearly so badly as Viridian. However, that's what Hound Dog, the counselor, was for. He'd help Izuku work through them even if he didn't want to talk about anything to the man, and then Izuku would be cleared to do hero work in those situations. He was still figuring out how to phrase everything to the man without sounding completely delusional. He was waiting until the end of the week because he knew it could pose the risk of taking him off the USJ trip, which he could not afford. All Might just smiled down at him. I understand, my boy, but you cannot always choose what powers your enemies have. Even if it makes you uncomfortable, I ask that you still bear with the exercise. If things start getting out of hand, I'll stop it. He isn't taking me seriously. Izuku sighed. If that's your final decision. Fuck you, too, dick. Okay, so maybe Izuku was being a little harsh. But he felt somewhat justified in his pettiness considering the man crushed his dreams twice. And yeah, he understood why he'd done it, and even mostly agreed with the man, but Izuku was still bitter about the whole thing. And considering all that he'd been through, he felt that he was allowed to be petty. Besides, All Might could have phrased it better when he'd crushed his dreams. Or, not left the quirkless kid alone on the very tall building the same day he'd been suicide-baited and had his dreams freshly crushed. When the match started, Izuku took a deep steadying breath. Eureka. The girl looked at him. Bakugo will come after me. I'll distract him to keep his heavy hits from you. Take this. He passed her a small canister. It's a smoke screen. He smirked. Try to use Itsu's speed against him. Right. Eureka grinned, taking it from Izuku with a smile. Go. Like a flash, Izuku and Eureka bolted into the building. As expected, Bakugo met them on the second floor, heading them off. Izuku motioned for Eureka to hide as he drew Bakugo's attention. You never change, do you, Bakugo? Shut the hell up, Deku. Since when do you even use my last name? That's what's got you pissed. Izuku sighed, as he saw Eureka sneak up the stairs from the corner of his eye. Bakugo Katsuki. We haven't been friends for a long time. I finally admit that now. He watched as the blonde flinched. Like I'd ever be friends with a quirkless reject like you. He snarled, lunging forward with his all-too-familiar right hook. Izuku easily dodged, catching his arm in a well-practiced motion and used his sai to pin him to the floor. It would have ended there if Bakugo hadn't used his other hand to fire an explosion at the ground, breaking the floor and sending the two crashing to the room below. Bakugo immediately jumped away and reared around to the offensive. So you've got some moves. Big deal. Bakugo snarled. You're still nothing. You'll never be a hero. Bakugo. Izuku flinched as another explosion went off. The smell of the dust that the explosion kicked up and the sound of the ceiling crumbling at the edges of the hole trudged up some rather nasty memories. It'll be alright, kid. Majima smiled as he patted Izuku's head. You'll make it out of this. I am not a kid. He protested through thick tears. Come with me. The others will be worried. He flinched at the sound of a nearby Nomura. You know I can't. Tell Nemuri and the others I'm sorry and stay safe, kiddo. Keep smiling. He gave Izuku a grin before standing up from their hiding place, leaving Izuku essentially buried in a safe hole Majima had dug just for him. See ya in the next life. Goodbye. Izuku smiled as best he could. Uncle Higuri. Izuku shook his head sharply, barely dodging a blow from Bakugo. He hadn't had to think about Power Loader's death in a long time. The man had run out to draw the Nomu away from Izuku's hiding spot. All he'd managed to find of the man after was few blood-stained pieces of clothing and some bone. That was it. I know you won't understand this, but there are bigger things for me to worry about than your approval. Izuku charged him, ducking under angry swings and dodging fierce blows. The explosions were starting to overwhelm him, and the smell of smoke and nitroglycerin filled his nostrils, mixing with the scent of ash and blood. He found that it made it harder to remember when he was. He kept catching ghost-like glimpses of fallen allies or Nomu out of the corner of his eyes. Sometimes, when Bakugo reached for him with his hand, he overlapped with the image of Shigaraki. His red eyes glinted in malice and perverted glee, and Izuku wasn't sure if that was the hallucination or not. Don't kill him. The thought ran through his mind. He had to remember. This was Bakugo, not a Nomua, not Shigaraki. Bakugo. He pulled back, restraining himself, fighting against years of instinct screaming at him to do otherwise. He fought at only a small percentage of his power. He couldn't go all out. Not against another human. Not against a fellow classmate. A child. The two finally jumped apart to catch their breath as Bakugo held up his hand, a hand that looked pale and was horribly dry from overuse of the disintegration quirk, one finger hooked in the pin on his gauntlet. Red eyes glinted in bloodlust as they thirsted for his death. You know what my quirk is, right? Well, nerd, what do ya think these are for? Izuku's eyes widened in startled realization as his vision focused on the present for that moment. Your sweat. Stop. That will kill him. All Might's voice rung out in worry, and Izuku heard the familiar voice of Shouta in the background. Shao? What's he doing here? Only if he doesn't dodge. Bakugo grinned as he pulled the pin. If Izuku hadn't spent a decade surviving against unbelievably fast and ludicrously strong Nomua, he probably would have actually died. But luckily for him, his reflexes were insane, and he managed to dodge most of the blast. It caught his right leg, burning the skin. The smell of burned flesh reached his nostrils, mixing with the dust kicked up from Bakugo's explosions. The scent mixed with blood became unnervingly similar to the scent of a decayed corpse from Shigaraki's quirk, and suddenly Izuku was completely gone. He didn't know when he was half sure his mind was playing tricks on him, but he heard some Nomua nearby. He glanced around himself quickly, and slipped into stealth mode, hiding in the best spot he could find. He'd wait out the Nomua. Shouta was smart enough to do the same. And if he was in trouble, Izuku would hear that, too. He'd go to help him if that were the case. He had a promise to Zushi to keep, after all. Shouta wouldn't die. He'd make sure of it. But he also promised Dabi that he'd look after himself. So he needed to survive. You're doing great, Spitfire. Dabi's hand ruffled his hair. You're doing just fine. Keep your knees bent a little more, yeah. Like that. He violently flung the thought out of his mind. This was no time to think of people long dead. They would survive. No matter what. Shouta was tired. Not that that was necessarily anything new, per se, but he was apprehensive about his student's first heroics class. Never one to let his gut feelings lie, he decided to observe All Might's lesson. It was the man's first time teaching, after all, so he'd likely need a hand reining in 19 rambunctious superpowered teenagers. He entered the observation room with All Might and the remaining 15 students as Uraraka, Itza, Bakugo, and Midoriya readied themselves for their battle. Shouta, personally, was against the idea of Bakugo and Midoriya facing one another, or a battle exercise right off the bat, but he trusted that All Might had enough common sense to lecture the students on safety first. Something about the way Bakugo had nearly lunged at the green-haired child during the assessment the day before had rubbed him the wrong way. Though the younger boy hadn't seemed fazed by the unprompted lunge, Shouta could see the way he tensed around the explosion that he'd almost fired off. He suspected this was a case of bullying or something similar, but with no evidence there was nothing Shouta could do about it except do his best to prevent any further altercations. Warily, he kept his eye on the match before him. He just had a feeling. Turn on the audio. Shouta spoke up, startling the blonde. He internally smirked. He loved having a stealth mode. Aizawa-san. I wasn't aware that you were observing the match today. I wanted to make sure you had an extra set of eyes on these kids. They're a handful. He explained, and All Might nodded. Audio. Shouta sighed. Before leaning over and pressing the obvious blue button with the headphone icon. Honestly, Nizu should have made him get a teaching degree at least. Even I had to take some private classes with Nizu to get mine. They listened as Midoriya handed what he explained was a smoke screen to Uraraka. Clever idea, but let's see how she uses it. Unfortunately, it wasn't long until Midoriya met with Bakugo. And the results were as explosive as Shouta had feared. You never change, do you, Bakugo? Midoriya smirked confidently, causing the blonde kid to bristle in anger. Shut the hell up, Deku. Since when do you even use my last name? That's what's got you pissed? Bakugo Katsuki. We haven't been friends for a long time. I finally admit that now. Shouta sighed. Obviously there's a lot of context I'm missing here. Like I'd ever be friends with a quirkless reject like you. Shouta's attention immediately became entirely focused on the fight. He had suspected that Bakugo's record wasn't as clean as it initially appeared, but or quirkless as the case was here, discrimination was very serious, especially for a prospective hero. Shouta also found himself appreciating the smooth form that Midoriya had, and his obvious expertise with the sai. He wielded them with experience beyond his years, and Shouta wondered where he'd learned to fight. Compared to Midoriya, Bakugo looked like a raging animal with no finesse, powerful, with strong instincts, but a lot of wasted energy and movement. Midoriya's movement wasted none, and actually reminded Shouta quite a bit of his own fighting style minus the capture weapon. He tensed when Bakugo blew a hole in the floor, freeing himself from his classmate's grasp. So you've got some moves. Big deal. Bakugo snarled. You're still nothing. You'll never be a hero. Shouta's eyes narrowed. This was a personal statement. He knew right there that both of these students would need to talk to Hound Dog, Bakugo for his anger and pride, and Midoriya for what was sure to be low self-esteem. Or trauma. Bakugo. Midoriya flinched as another explosion went off, and Shouta took a deep breath. He didn't like the feeling he was getting. And for a moment, Midoriya froze. No. Shouta's eyes narrowed. That's not right. This is something else. But between the shitty angle of the camera and the dust settling, Shouta couldn't name what it was before the kid snapped himself out of it. I know you won't understand this, but there are bigger things for me to worry about than your approval. Something's not right. The dust settled and he could see a lot more clearly. Midoriya's eyes, they were somewhat glassy and he didn't look completely there. It was as if he didn't completely recognize where he was beyond the fight. That worried Shouta. A lot. And then something changed. It was subtle, and the shift was one that Shouta only barely noticed, but Midoriya went from a sparring fighting style to a fighting for your life style. He caught Midoriya altering several moves at the last minute that would have been lethal for Bakugo, if he hadn't changed course. That was when he'd decided that enough was enough. He moved to stop the match before someone got killed, when Bakugo spoke up. You know what my quirk is, right? Well, nerd, what do ya think these are for? Your sweat. Midoriya's eyes went wide in horror, as did Shouta's. Stop. That will kill him. All Might shouted over the intercom. Bakugo, if you pull that pin, Shouta started, but Bakugo didn't hear him. Only if he doesn't dodge. Shouta felt anger well up alongside his fear as the pin was pulled and a massive explosion took out their visual feed. Young Bakugo. Is everyone okay? All Might asked, but Shouta hit a button on the panel instead. Stop the exercise. Anyone continuing to fight will be expelled. Shouta promised as All Might sent him an affronted look. I'm going to go check on Midoriya and Bakugo. Call recovery girl, there's sure to be injuries. All Might nodded meekly and went to do as told. Stay put. Shouta glared at the remaining students, who nodded and planted their feet where they stood. They looked half terrified, and if that was of Shouta, then good, he'd done something right. His heart pounded in worry. Bakugo was leaning casually against a wall, acting like nothing was wrong. You are going to wait for me in Nizu's office. We will have a nice long discussion on why that was not okay. Argue or attempt to go elsewhere, and you'll find yourself expelled. Shouta glared, and Bakugo straightened in shock and nodded. I get the feeling this kid's never been reprimanded before. Newsflash, brat, UA doesn't cater to your inflated ego. Aiza and Uraraka came down the stairs, worry evident on their faces. Aizawa-sensei. Uraraka asked. Go join your classmates. While I locate Midoriya. He ordered, and Aiza herded the girl away. Shouta was good at finding people he had to be to find the crooks and rapists lurking in back alleyways at 2 in the morning. But he couldn't for the life of him find Midoriya. And that scared him. It wasn't until he finally caught sight of a few drops of blood on the floor, likely from cutting himself on rubble, that his eyes focused on a deathly still figure hiding in the rubble. Wide green eyes stared around his environment, as if tracking unseen enemies. He flinched, twitched, more like at unheard sounds, and his breathing was almost non-existent. Shouta realized that his student was stuck in some kind of flashback. Midoriya. No reaction. Midoriya Izuku. He tried again, noticing that his student twitched a little. At the sound of his given name. Shouta. Shouta blinked. Why was the kid using his given name? He decided not to question it right now. Yeah, kid. It's me. He carefully made his way over to him. Can you tell me where you are right now? Abandoned building. I can hear them nearby. Making a break for it would be too dangerous, though. Too many. Are you hurt? Midoriya's voice was scarcely a whisper, and Shouta couldn't help but feel a little heartbroken to see the hardened and fearful look on his face. Just what had happened to this kid? He looked like a soldier in a war zone. I'm okay. Listen to me. You're at UA. You're safe, it's okay. Nobody is going to hurt you. He kept his voice calm and soft, and the kid blinked a few times in confusion. There's no one here but us. But I can hear them. Hear who? The Noma. There was a pause. Was that the name of some kind of group? Shouta? Are they okay? Zushi. And Nemuri. And Majima. Why is this kid calling us by our given names? And Power Loader, too? Yeah. Everyone's okay, Izuku. He rolled with it, calling him by his given name. The kid relaxed substantially, so Shouta assumed it was the right call. Recovery. Girl is waiting for you. Recovery. Girl. But she. His brows furrowed together before his eyes cleared a bit. Shouta carefully placed a hand on the kid's shoulder, and he found Midoriya's hand grasping his arm like a lifeline. When am I? He asked desperately. The question made Shouta falter for a moment. Not where am I, but when. It's Tuesday. Year 2365. You just started your first year of UA Hero course. He answered quietly, and the boy froze for a moment before he melted into his arms. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. I didn't mean to. Shouta ignored the tears that were soaking into his capture weapon as he held his student. He reached up to his radio. All Might, I've found him. He's hurt, but nothing life-threatening. I'm taking him to Recovery Girl myself. He then turned his attention back to the obviously traumatized child. It's all right, Midoriya. You have nothing to apologize for. I must have confused you so much, and I'm so sorry. Shouta didn't know why, but he got the distinct impression that the kid was apologizing for something more than his breakdown. Regardless, he wasn't about to let his classmates see him like this, so he took an alternate route to Recovery Girl's office. Oh dear. She said the moment she saw Shouta with an injured student passed out in his arms. The kid had a death grip on him even in his sleep. Training accident ended up triggering some sort of flashback. Shouta explained. He seemed to recognize me, though, and asked after Mike, Midnight, and Power Loader. Strange. Her brows furrowed before she turned to tend to his injuries. Shouta was barely able to tear the kid from his arms, and when he did, the boy whimpered lightly. He seems very attached to you. Cho grinned, giggling under her breath. I have to inform the other teachers about this development. He sighed. Call me when he wakes up. If he's still in the flashback, I should be able to bring him out of it. Right, dearie. Thank you for the heads up. With that, Shouta closed the door behind him. Ugh, today sucks already. He shook his head. He still had to deal with Bakugo. But first, he needed to inform the other teachers of the now obvious PTSD that Midoriya had, and had neglected to inform them of. He'd chew the kid out for that later. He sent off a quick text to his co-workers. Luckily, it was most everyone's free period, so Cementos, Snipe, Present Mike, Ectoplasm, Midnight, and 13 were all in the staff room. He'd have to inform Power Loader of the situation later. Shouta? What's wrong? I thought you were observing your class. Hisashi's eyes flashed in concern when he noted the dust and blood on his costume. There was an incident. Bakugo disobeyed a direct order and used an attack of lethal force on Midoriya. The room stiffened. He's fine. Somehow the kid managed to dodge it, but his leg was burned pretty badly. He's with Cho, now. But the attack triggered a flashback. I was only barely able to pull him out of it, A flashback? Cementos asked in concern. He was talking about hearing Noma nearby, whatever that is, and his eyes were tracking invisible enemies. Kid was so quiet I almost didn't find him. But he seemed to recognize me. His brows knitted together in concern. Isn't that a good thing? Midnight asked. That's the thing. He called me Shouta, and only reacted when I called him by his given name. That's strange. 13 conceded. He also asked about Zushi, Namuri, and Majima. Shouta looked at Mike and Midnight, who startled at their own names. He came back to himself before he passed out, but if anything happens again and I'm not around, I think you two could manage to pull him out of a flashback. Call it a hunch. That's actually somewhat unnerving, having a student call me by my given name. Midnight scratched her head. Do you two know him outside of school? Snipe asked. No, never met the kid before he attended here. Mike shook his head, and Namuri nodded in agreement. I think we should all keep a closer eye on him. Any idea what specifically triggered it? Cementos asked. Maybe I can answer that question. All Might said, coming into the room. Shouta glanced at the clock. It was already the end of the day. Before the start of the battle, Midoriya Shounen came up to me and confessed that he had bad reactions to explosions. I assumed they just made him uncomfortable, and he said that he was going to talk to Hound Dog at the end of the week about it. He wanted to switch partners, but you made him face Bakugo anyways. Shouta pinched the bridge of his nose. How irresponsible. 13 tooted. Didn't you read the handbook? Handbook? All Might questioned, causing the entire room to groan. Here. Snipe chucked something at his head, and nearly hit him right on the nose with his impeccable aim. Every teacher is required to have that memorized before even setting foot in a classroom. He crossed his arms. Page 27 talks about what to do when a student who's suspected of having a traumatic experience in the past confesses a possible trigger. Ectoplasm stated dryly, sending All Might a mild glare of his own. In short, you excuse that student from the situation that could re-traumatize them, and inform their homeroom teacher privately before informing the rest of the staff. In this case, you would have given him a different opponent and kept a closer eye on him while he observed Bakugo's fight. Shouta stepped in. Immediately after class, you would have informed me of the situation, before I informed the rest of the staff to prevent re-traumatizing him. Oh. Yeah. Oh. Shouta sighed. You can apologize to Midoriya after Recovery Girl and Hound Dog have cleared him. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have a student to discipline. He paused in the doorway. Zushi, I think you or Nemuri should go see if the kid's okay. He'll probably respond better to you two than anyone else right now. He sent them meaningful looks and the two smiled. I'll go. The little listener's growing on me. Hisashi grinned, heading out the door, closing it behind him with a soft click. I'll inform Power Loader. Ectoplasm sighed. Thank you. Shouta sighed as he watched Bakugo leave the office. His punishment was light, in Shouta's opinion, but there wasn't much they could do for a first offense. So he'd be on restriction for 2 weeks. Allowed to observe and participate in team-building activities while attending counseling with Hound Dog every day. He looked up when the door opened. Nizu had wanted to speak with Midoriya regarding the incident, and had Hisashi and Nemuri accompany him up to the office. He was bandaged, and had a light limp, but looked fine. Otherwise, he looked a little tired, but that was probably from Recovery Girl's quirk. You feeling better? Shouta asked, and the kid nodded. He didn't miss the way he relaxed when he saw Shouta sitting there. The boy was unusually attached to him, and for the life of him he couldn't figure out why. Welcome, Midoriya. Please have a seat. Nizu motioned, and Shouta stood to leave. Actually. Izawa-sensei. You three can stay if you want. Midoriya spoke up, and Shouta sat back down. He'd be lying if he said he wasn't curious. He saw the expression mirrored on the other two heroes' faces. I understand that you had quite the experience today. I wanted to apologize for you getting hurt. Nizu said. Oh, that's not your fault. Bakugo's always been that way. He answered off-handedly. I'd have been more careful if I'd have known about the gauntlets, but that's my fault for being ill-informed. Shouta stared. This kid was far too mature. Either way, Nizu continued, handing a cup of tea to the boy, who took it gratefully. I'd like to know what exactly triggered your flashback earlier. To prevent any future setbacks, and to keep you on the right track, you need to inform us of any major trauma in your past. Wait, you mean I'm not getting kicked out of the hero course? He blinked in shock. Shouta startled. Of course you aren't. He stated. Kid, 9 out of 10 pros have PTSD or something similar. It comes with the job. To disqualify a hero hopeful for something you'll likely get anyways is illogical. But we can help you with it before you head out. There. He relaxed substantially, and Shouta wondered if that had been weighing on him this entire time. Was that why he hadn't informed them? I'm sorry. It's okay, little listener. We're here to help you. Hisashi spoke up, and Midoriya sent him a small gentle smile. There was a tinge of sorrow there, though, and he noticed that the kid's hand went to touch something under his shirt. Like he wore a necklace of some kind. Shouta squinted a little. Yep. There was a glint of rusted silver. A very old necklace, it would seem. Part of it is collapsing buildings. And the smell of decay, and unfortunately, burning flesh mixed with nitroglycerin and whatever else was in that building happened to smell similar enough to, well, yeah. Decay. Shouta stiffened, along with the other heroes. What the hell kind of situation had this kid been through? As far as he knew, the boy's mother was alive and well, and his father worked overseas. There'd been nothing in his records indicating anything even remotely traumatic, either. Though it was possible that something had happened and the police had just not bothered to document it due to his quirkless status. As much as Shouta hated it, some people just didn't care about someone who didn't have a quirk. Mostly, the biggest thing is silence. He spoke quietly, and Shouta noticed it now. He shifted in his seat. He did that in class, too. The kid was always making some kind of small, quiet noise. The silence that follows explosions is the worst. They tend to send me into flashbacks. Shouta finished for him. Yeah. So you saw that? He winced. Yes. Nobody else did, though. But you called me by my given name. Midoriya flinched lightly. I am sorry, sir. I meant no offense. I'm not offended, just curious. The look on the kid's face told him that the boy was embarrassed, and ashamed. But his eyes told Shouta a different story. Grief, regret, anger, loss. The emotions were overwhelming and Shouta looked away, feeling like he was violating some part of the kid just from seeing that. Can you explain what kind of experience brought on this trauma? Nizu asked gently. The kid looked out the window behind Nizu for a moment, and Shouta was briefly afraid he'd fallen into another flashback. I lost some people very dear to me. It was a villain attack, there was this terrible silence. Afterwards, he gently touched the necklace. I'll never forget that scream. I had to knock one of them out because he wanted to go back for the other, but the kid's hand clenched, and Shouta knew what had happened. This boy had been forced to choose between two lives that were precious to him. Likely, if the kid had stayed to help the other, all three would be dead. This kid was way too young to have an experience like that. To have to make that kind of choice. Nemuri looked ready to cry, and Hisashi looked heartbroken. Even Nizu looked mildly disturbed, though he quickly masked it before the kid could notice. At the very least, this kid already had what it took to be a pro, of that Shouta was now certain. Not many people could even make that kind of choice. Nizu took a moment to digest this information. Thank you for telling us, Midoriya. I'd like for you to meet with Hound Dog every day. The kid nodded. I was going to go to him at the end of the week. Good, you'll start those meetings tomorrow during your free period, then. Nizu smiled. Now, on to the topic originally scheduled for today, the entrance exams. He leaned forward in glee, and Midoriya relaxed. Almost completely. If Shouta hadn't seen how tense he was a minute ago, he wouldn't have suspected anything. It was like he flipped a switch. The kid was way too good at hiding trauma. Looked like the staff needed to up their game. What, exactly, did you do? Well, I figured the robots were all connected to some wireless system. Midoriya started, eyes shining as a smirk danced on his lips. His Meek posture from earlier dropped away along with his nerves, and the kid that sat before them looked confident and happy. It was like night and day. Shouta found himself thinking that the boy was far too used to dealing with flashbacks and trauma if he could bounce back this quickly. The test is dangerous, and even if each one was individually programmed, you still needed some emergency shut-off sequence just in case. Of course, that applies to the zero-pointer, too. Perhaps especially the zero-pointer. Not every teacher here has the firepower to take that thing down should it rampage out of control, and if all of them do so, then there may not be enough time to prevent casualties. So a remote shut-off is a must. I simply found the code in the smaller robot, and hacked it to send out the force shutdown signal. He sat back with a grin. Amazing. Nizu's grin matched Midoriya's. Not only did you manage to reverse hack it, but you did so in an unbelievable amount of time. He leaned forward again. Midoriya Izuku, would you like to become my private student? Shouta shared a horrified look with his friends. Oh shit. If this kid accepted the offer. Principal Nizu. Izuku leaned forward with a fearsome smirk of his own. I would love to. The two cackled together, and Shouta felt a strong chill run down his spine. We're doomed. It wasn't until they were nearly out the doors of UA, that Shouta remembered the upcoming field trip. Midoriya. He stopped the kid, who turned and looked at him with a questioning gaze. There's a field trip tomorrow. I think, all things considered, you should stay here. Something flashed in his eyes. Desperation, pain, fear, panic. Please, sir. I'm okay, now. So long as I'm not around unexpected explosions, I'll be fine. He promised, looking at him with those dark green eyes. They were begging him. He opened his mouth to argue, when Midoriya spoke up again. I promise I'll tell you if I feel off or bothered in any way, okay? He felt his mouth set in a thin line. What a problem, child. He finally sighed. Fine. But your mother has to sign this. He handed over a paper. The kid stiffened almost unnoticeably. Shouta's eyes narrowed imperceptibly. Something wasn't right here. Abuse? It wasn't uncommon for a quirkless kid, after all. Maybe he'd do home checks soon. Okay. Thank you, Aizawa-sensei. Midoriya grinned, and Shouta was almost convinced. Almost. Kyokan Izuku called out when he got back into the clearing of trash he called home. Kigo looked up from the book he'd been reading. He'd found it in the mound of trash earlier while poking through the pile curiously. Seriously, who throws away a perfectly good book? Zukin. He didn't know why Izuku came up with these nicknames, but it seemed to make the 15-year-old happy, so who was he to complain? Besides, it wasn't like he'd ever really had anyone he was close enough with to have a nickname for before. And if Kigo was being honest, he really enjoyed it. Not that he'd admit that aloud. I need you to be my mother. Kigo spit out the sip of lemonade he'd taken. I'm sorry, what? This permission slip. Izuku held up a piece of paper, and the hero felt his pulse even out. I need my mother's signature, but that's out of the question. I suck at forging signatures, and he's never seen her handwriting before, so please. Kigo blinked as his brain restarted. Fine. He sighed and held out his hand. Give it here. Yes. A field trip. MMMHM. Izuku nodded his head enthusiastically. And why exactly do you need this slip signed when this is a trip on campus? Because Bakugo tried to kill me and sent me into a flashback during our heroics class. Kigo was going to go gray. Young. I think I need more explanation than that, Ziu. Well, remember how we were talking about triggers the other day and stuff? Izuku waited for Kigo to nod. Well, one of those triggers happens to be explosions. Or rather, collapsing buildings and then the smell of explosions. Especially when mixed with burning flesh. He sheepishly pulled up his pant leg to show a new scar. Burning flesh? He echoed. I don't know if I want to know right now. Maybe I should come with you to school. Kigo groaned. I thought you'd be safe at UA. At least when you're on patrol, you've got Aizawa with you. Hold on, how did it get to that point? Who's your heroics teacher? All Might. What? Kigo decided he was going to stop drinking his lemonade before he choked to death. Yep, Izuku popped the pea cheerfully, as if he didn't just drop 3 bombshells in a row on him. Zukin, you're going to be the death of me one of these days. Kigo sighed as he found a pen. Now, what's your MO? He trailed off when he caught sight of the serious expression on Izuku's face. Please don't joke about that. I've seen enough friends die because of me. I don't want to imagine your death, too. Not for the first time, Kigo wondered just what had happened to Midoriya Izuku. He was such an enigma. 15 and quirkless, and yet he was Japan's most elusive and wanted vigilante. To the point where he could propose a partnership with the local police force and heroes, and get it accepted on his terms. Kigo was sure Izuku wasn't aware of just how much power he had as Viridian. Not only that, but he had a mysterious and dark past that reeked of blood and death. Kigo hoped that whatever it was wouldn't come back to bite him in the butt, because Kigo had no plans to leave his newfound brother to fend for himself. He just hoped that Izuku would tell him about it before it became a necessary thing. Sorry. He apologized awkwardly. I need your mother's name to forge her signature. Oh, right. Midoriya Enko. That was another thing. Kigo realized a while back that Izuku's parents were still alive. He did a little digging around and found that his mother was still living in Musudafu. I've been meaning to ask, but why do you live alone? Kigo handed back the permission slip. You mean why don't I live with my mother and father? Yeah. My father hates the quirkless. He explained carefully as he sat down. He twisted my mother's views on the quirkless until she stopped caring about me. In all honesty, she hasn't looked at me since I was 8. She doesn't care if I'm alive or dead, and whenever my father comes home, it's not pretty. Kigo shuddered at the image his friend was painting for him. So I figured I was safer on my own. I packed up my stuff and came here where nobody would bother me. You know, until you showed up. Izuku playfully shoved Kigo, and just like that the lighter atmosphere was back. Well, I've got the wings for it, so I guess I'll be your mother hen for now. He smirked back. Hey. I'm not a kid. Izuku pouted. You're 15. You're a kid. Oh yeah. How do you forget your age? A backlash of trauma. Izuku carefully answered. That makes no sense. It wasn't supposed to. Get some rest, Zukin. You've got a long day tomorrow. You can say that again.